Hi, I'm working on our Swirling Star uh, quilt. I don't know if you can see this over here. This is the one I'm working on right now. And I'm going to show you how to do the blade for the actual Swirling Star. And I'm not sure how good you're going to see this, but I want to show it to you anyway to show you how simple it really is. I have, well, first of all, this is one blade. I don't know if you can see the lines on there. This is one blade. There's 8 to the quilt. There's four strips this way, 4 strips of 4 pieces. So to make it as simple as possible, I'm having you cut all of your pieces the same size. This is the size it says in the pattern, and I don't have it with me right now to tell you. I could probably tell you. They measure 2.5 by 5.5. All of them cut the same size, so it makes it very easy. There is a chart that tells you how many of each one to cut, and I do believe I have you cut them in a 5.5-inch strip by the width of fabric, and then cut your 2.5 inches to the correct number. And I think this morning I counted, I don't even want to say. But anyway, then what I have done is there's 8 fabrics, 8 colors to the quilt. So I lay them out in order, the order that I'm going to be, that they're going to be in on the blade. Anyway, then what I do is I start with row 1, piece number 1, and I lay it out 1, 2, 3, 4. Then go to row number 2, lay them out. Actually, then it's 4, 3, 2, 1, and then the next third row 1, 2, 3, 4, and the next row 4, 3, 2, 1, to make sure that I have my colors in the proper order. Then I stack each of the 4 rows in numerical order with piece number 1 on the top. And now I'm ready to go. So what we'll do is we're going to take fabric piece number 1, we're going to set it with the wrong side facing up. Then I'm going to take my foundation and I'm going to do, it says row 1, it's number 1, and then row 1. I'm going to set it on top of the fabric, and I really don't know if you can see, but I'll try to explain it as I go. I want to have it cover the entire space number 1 on the foundation and go past the dotted line on the 2 sides. Excuse me. I want to have about 1/4 of an inch of fabric extending past the line between number 1 and number 2. Let me show you. I don't know if you can see there, there's about 1/4 of an inch of fabric going past that line between 1 and 2, and it goes past all those lines all the way around. And instead of just leaving it pinned, and I'll explain why, I'm going to run a line of stitching in between the cutting line and the stitching line on the bottom. Just a real quick row of stitching to hold it in place, because as you're going to be flipping this back and forth, and you're going to have to trim, and this just keeps the fabric from flopping around and getting in your way when you're trimming. So it becomes a real part of the foundation. You're leaving it in anyway, so not a problem. So I have it in place with 1/4 inch going past the line into space number 2. So I'm going to turn it over so the right side of my fabric is facing up, and I'm going to take fabric piece number 2. I'm going to put right sides together, and the important part here is I'm going to line, as I'm looking at it, the top left corner of piece number 2. I'm going to line it up right where the fabric from number 1 crosses the dotted line on the outside. And that and line those edges up even. That assures me, if you want to check to make sure, that when I stitch it and I open it up, it's going to cover the whole section or space for number 2. And that's just, you'll be lining every piece you add. That's how you'll be lining it up. The left top corner, even with the dotted line on the left side. And I do pin, and because it's a long piece, kind of wild, I pin both sides back away from where I'm going to sew. I pin them back here because I'm going to be sewing up here. Then we're going to turn it over and we're going to take it to the machine. And a few things before I start stitching. We're going to use a regular stitch length because we're leaving the foundation in. So no need to do the real tiny stitch to perforate paper. That way, if you do make a mistake, it's much easier to take your stitching out. You won't ruin your foundation. If you do miss stitch and have to take stitches out, I recommend taking it out on the fabric side, not the foundation side, just so you don't accidentally rip a hole in your foundation. I like to use an open toe foot, or a foot where I can actually see where my needle is stitching as I'm going along the line, because you want to be stitching on the line. And the lines are about the width of your thread. So in a perfect world, when you stitch, you shouldn't see the black line or the dark gray line after you've stitched. It's not always perfect, but as you want to be as close as possible, let's just say that, because you have points that you want to match. When you sew the 2 rows together, you want your points to come out, and they're not going to come out if you don't sew on the line. And if you have trouble following a line, I recommend, and I know this sounds kind of maybe childish or whatever, but a lot of us have trouble sewing a straight line or following a line. And to get real used to it, what I suggest is put an old needle in your machine, no thread, bobbin or top thread, and take a piece of binder paper with a straight, it's already got your straight lines on there. Just practice following your lines. It'll give you a little more confidence when you go to do this if you struggle following a line. Don't rush it. Go slow. It's better to be a little slow and perfect than it is to be fast and imperfect. Imperfect lines are going to give you imperfect points. And the whole reason we're doing the foundation is because we want that perfection. As to thread, I just use, this one has lights and dark, this quilt has lights and dark fabrics in it. I'm still using an off-white, a beige, kind of a darkish beige, a neutral. And I don't recall doing any quilts where I've had my threads show. So you want to make sure your tension's good, and go for it. So I'm gonna stitch piece number 2 on here, and I'm going to, you want to start where the line starts, stop where the line stops. On this particular block, on the 2 outside rows, row number 1, row number 4, the stitching goes all the way out to the broken line, but on the inside of those 2 rows, in row 2 and 3, you only want to stitch to the solid up and down line, and I'll show you why as we progress. But just remember, you only want to stitch where the line goes, starts and stops. That's your indication of how far to stitch. You do not back stitch, because if you go too far, you want to be able to pull the extra stitches out. So when you fold your fabric and your foundation back to expose the extra fabric, if you stitch too far, and you pull it back, and if you pull it back quickly, there is a very slight chance, but there is a chance that you can rip a little hole in your foundation, or that it doesn't make it full back nice and smooth. It's probably not going to make a huge difference. It's just a lot more convenient if you don't overstitch. So, and back stitching, the reason we have you run your stitching out to the dotted line in through the seam allowance on the outer edges is because your block will be sitting there for a hopefully a small length of time without being stitched together. So you want your extra stitches to run out so it won't pull apart, or your piece won't pull apart. But all your other ones where they stop at the solid line, you're going to be stitching those lines together relatively soon, and so they're not going to, you have, as long as you have lines, stitching lines over stitching lines, there's no need to back stitch. I don't back stitch anything until I'm adding borders or things like that. So so we've stitched this on the line. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but we've stitched on the line. So now our next step is to take it to the pressing mat. And I set my seams first. It makes less of a ridge. Your thread will actually make a little bit of a ridge when you fold your fabric over it. So if you set your seams, it sinks the thread into your fabric, and a little bit less wedge or ridge. So there we have our first two pieces. Now we're going to set it on our cutting mat with the foundation side facing up. We're going to put our straight edge along the line between space number 2 and number 3. I put it so I can just barely see the stitching line. And we're going to fold the foundation back over the straight edge, and this is where you want to use your add a quarter ruler. It's got a 1/4 inch lip on it, so it just hooks onto that straight edge, and trim away that little bit of extra. And a lot of people think, oh, that doesn't matter, that little bit of extra. But when you turn, if you didn't trim it down to a 1/4 inch, when you placed piece number 3 here, you wouldn't have an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'd have more. So if you put your edges together, it's going to take up more of the width of your fabric piece. When you stitch it, you've taken up more than a 1/4 inch. When you open it up, you may not have nearly enough a 1/4 inch for the next, to sew the next piece on. And all of these pieces that we've cut, they're slightly larger than they need to be, to allow for when you cut, if you cut a lot of layers, and it's off just a tiny bit, it's okay. But if you didn't trim, you would have a lot of problems. So it's just best to get in the habit of the 3 steps of stitching it, pressing it, and then trimming it. So now we're going to set piece number 3 right sides together. That left corner is going to be up here at the dotted line on the left side. And again, I'm going to pin it. I have been doing this for 15 years or more, and I still like to pin. I could flip it, I could put it in place and flip it over, but more times than not, it will, in the flipping process, it will move. Most times it's not enough to be a problem, but I just feel that you get a better finished product if you don't be afraid to use pins. I know a lot of people don't like to take the time to pin. My opinion is, and this is just my opinion, I would rather take a little more time to make it right, to make it perfect, to avoid the frustration of using our little seam rippers. And just these little things. I keep my threads trimmed. I try to keep my projects extremely neat. If you're neat, you tend to make less mistakes. Slow down and do it right, and I think you'll really be happy. And in the long run, you're going to be done faster because you aren't doing a bunch of ripping out. Your seams, your points, everything will match. You'll be much happier. And as you can see, as I go, I trim. I don't like my tails any longer than 1/4 of an inch. And you trim, it's really important to trim your threads, because if you get a thread stuck under, say you're sewing with a medium to dark thread, but you have one piece of light fabric in there, and if you leave the threads in, it gets caught underneath it, it's going to show through. And besides that, it's not real neat looking. Okay, so after we've stitched, we're coming back over to the pressing mat, set those seams, and turn it over, and we have 3 pieces sewn. Our next step, step number 3, is to trim it. Put that straight edge along the next seam line, the line between space 3 and space 4, and get my out 1/4. Trim that little bit. It's not enough waste to be worried about. I hear that a lot. And I'll tell you, if I trim anything larger than 1 inch by 1 inch, I keep it. I do mini quilts also. So it's always nice to just have a large box of little scraps. And you can make some pretty neat quilts from those little tiny scraps. And I keep most of my pieces to either squares, rectangles, half square triangles. Rarely do we need a template. I know that there is, some people feel there's a lot of waste when you paper piece or foundation piece, and it's entirely up to you. If you want to make templates for any of these, you can, what I suggest is trace the size of, or the shape of the piece that you need, and add at least 3/8 to all 4 sides, or whatever shape it is, 3 sides, and then cut your fabric from that. You do have to remember that when you make the shape, everything is a mirror image of what you're going to finish with. So you have to take that into account when you are cutting things with angles, which is why I keep them to simple shapes, so you don't have that problem. When I was paper piecing and people, designers did not give you any instructions as to sizes to cut your pieces, I know there was a lot of waste, because a lot of times you would cut a piece, sew it on, and it would be at the wrong angle. It would be, you know, I should have done it the opposite, or a mirror image of what I did, but it was hard to remember to do that. And it just, if you go with our cutting instructions, it will save you a lot of time and a lot of waste, and a lot of, you know, not just the waste of the fabric, but a waste of your time. And my feeling is, let's cut these as simple as possible. I cut a lot of layers of fabric at the same time when I'm having to cut the same size pieces. I want to get to the sewing part. And cutting always bothered me. I was always a nervous Nelly when I was cutting for a traditionally pieced quilt. And I still am, which is why I rarely do a traditionally pieced quilt. Okay, so we have all 4 pieces for row number 1 sewn together. My camera wants to move on me. So now we're going to set it on the cutting mat with the foundation side facing up. I'm right-handed, so I have the row of fabrics on the left side. I'm going to take my straight edge, and for those of you who haven't attended a class or a show and seen me demo, these are our little grippy straight edges, and my husband makes these, and they're cardstock, and they're laminated with a fine grit sandpaper. So I lay it down with the cardstock side down on the foundation so I can move it around and get it in the correct position. And I'm going to line that up with the long line on the foundation. And I'm going to fold the foundation back, and that exposes all those corners of those 4 pieces. And my straight edge isn't quite as long as my seam line, so I just kind of press those down. And now I'm going to use my 12-inch add a quarter and just hook that onto my straight edge, or my my grippy straight edge. And then I'm going to cut off these corners. And normally these corners, these are really not quite, I guess they are a little, they are about it, you might be able to get it inch by an inch. But I have some miniature quilts that have very tiny half square triangles in them, so they get saved. Okay, so there is my 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's the front side, and there's the back side. And you can see how, whoops, come on. You can see you have a 1/4 inch there. Now we're ready to start the second side. We're going to do the second side the exact same way. You start with number 1, which is the opposite side. This blue one was piece number 1. So on the next row, and this is totally your option, but we have you starting up at the top up here. That puts your seam allowances going the opposite direction. So when you put these seams together, it's a little less bulk. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to my last blade, which is totally covered. And it's trimmed, whoops, trimmed between each row. Okay, now what we're going to do, if my camera would follow me over here, come on, there we go. We're going to take just row 1, flip it over, fold it. There's a dotted line, a solid line, and a dotted line very close together. If you can make your fold on the solid line, you're halfway home. What I do then is I put my pin right at where the seam line is, just like a thread from where the actual seam is. So I'm coming down through just 1 layer of fabric instead of 2, instead of going, and I look to see where my pin comes out on the other side, and I want it to be like the one thread to the right. See where my pin has come through right there, and this is where I put it through so that your points are at the same place. Now, you do not want to rock your pin. You don't want to rock it to put the other end in. You want to hold it perpendicular to the fabric to hold those two together. Take a second pin and now put it in down here and bring it out so you hold that point together. If you rock it, you're moving your threads a couple of, the bottom side of the 2 layers of fabric, your bottom side goes down a couple of threads, which will make it off just a hair. And now I'm going to do the same thing at the next point. And if you fold it on the, so that the solid line is right down that fold, this should match up pretty easy like these are doing. Perfect. and then I match the end point where the two seam lines come together. I guess on the light side would be easier to see, where this line and this line come together. Match that to the same place on the bottom side. Put my pin in there, then I go back and I do my end point at the bottom. My pin in. Okay, now we're going to take it to the machine and we're going to stitch down that long line. Take my pin out. And I used to split foundation and open my seams, but I've had very good luck with just pressing the seam allowance to one side. And all of those points came out perfect. They're all perfect. So we'll just press that seam allowance. Oh, this is so satisfying, so exciting. So there they all are. And then we're just going to do the same with this row. Fold it over, pin it, stitch it, and then this row. And then when that's all done, you're going to, let me grab one of these. You'll trim around the outside edge 1/4 inch from the solid line all the way around, and your blade is done. And that's all there is to it. Hopefully we'll get a little bit better instructional video on there, but I hope this helps you. And if nothing more, it shows you how simple it really is to make these. And one last thing, when you sew all these blades together, a lot of times when you do these without the foundation, you will get a mound of fabric as you go towards the middle. All these edges are on the bias. No matter how you make it, you're going to have bias edges, and their natural inclination is to stretch. No matter how hard you can start your pieces and everything, but just as it goes through the sewing machine, even if you use a walking foot, one side may stretch a little more than the other. They both, if they're, you're sewing two bias edges together, there's a very good chance. And even a slight stretch it's gonna multiply by 8, and you'll end up with a mountain of fabric in the middle. It's very hard to get it quilted out. So with this, it is not going to stretch. You're not going to know the foundation's in the quilt. It doesn't change anything about the way it feels or anything, but it does keep your fabrics from stretching. So when you sew it together, it just comes out flat, the whole thing. So you'll be very pleased with it. Anyway, I hope that helps. Hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how simple this all is. And if if you have any questions, you can give Laura or I a call or send us a message. That's the best way to get a hold of us. And because a lot of times if we're doing stuff like this, we're not answering our phone, or we're off doing other things to printing or production or whatever. So a message is probably the best way. We will get back to you. We try very hard to get back to you right away. So anyway, hope that helps. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you for the next project. Thanks.